Hello and welcome to the OnFraud podcast, where we talk about the latest fraud news, insights and trends. I'm Simon Horswell.
Hi, I'm Dimitri Radin.
And in today's podcast, we're going to be taking a little change from our normal setup in that today we have a special guest with us. I'm delighted to introduce Alan Gooden. Alan, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, hi, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the intro.
Now, Alan, I think some people here will probably be aware of who you are, but for those who aren't, could you tell us a bit about yourself and give us some of your background?
Yeah, sure. Well, currently, and I guess the reason for us coming together today, currently I'm working on behalf of the Association of Document Validation Professionals, which I've been doing since the beginning of 2018, when they were set up, a trade body that looks after the interests of UK businesses that are involved in the electronic validation of identity documents. But prior to that, and up till 2017, I was actually a police officer, a career police officer for 30 years. Retired in 2017 from the City of London, where I was a detective superintendent. But prior to that, for the first 24 plus years, I was in Essex Police, doing general policing work of varied descriptions. And then in 2012, I was seconded to the Home Office, representing the police service as part of a cross-cutting policy-making team advising the government in relation to matters concerning identity crime and crime facilitated even by the criminal use of a false identity. So during my time at the Home Office, I was Secretariat for the Identity Crime National Policing Working Group and Portfolio, coordinating operational activities against criminals involved in the manufacture and supply of false and fraudulent documents, and wrote some national policy and guidance. And it was about 2015 when I started crossing over with my work with the City of London, and eventually ended up and finished my time there as the Deputy National Police Coordinator for Fraud and a number of other national policing portfolios, including identity crime. And then, of course, as I've mentioned, after retirement, was asked to go and do some work on behalf of the ADVP, of which OnFraud is a member.
Yeah, which is where our paths crossed. So if I've understood that correctly, then before 2012, you didn't really have any exposure to fraud. Is that right? As in identity fraud, I should say.
Well, yeah, I mean, even to some degree, fraud itself, when I went to the Home Office, it was a new thing for me going into the world of fraud. And I think that's unfortunately in some ways a bit of a common theme across forces outside of London, really, that there is less of an emphasis on the work of fraud. And for me, moving into that world was a great sort of eye-opener, really, because until that time I had a real lack of awareness of identity crime, which is specifically what we're interested in. But I think really a lack of sort of general understanding and a lack of skill set in relation to fraud, really.
Yes. I tend to agree. I think this has been quite a common theme in the various places that I've been around the world and the various different sort of police authorities I've talked to. There's always kind of like, it's almost like a sense of catch up of like, oh Christ, there's this thing called identity fraud. What do we know about it? And it's always a discovery rather than something that seems to get taught from the beginning of the police career, which I always found is a sort of a strange way to go about it. 'Cause it's always been about.
Alan, I was going to ask you, how is the relation or the connection that you got towards identity fraud? Is it right to assume that via investigating other types of criminal activity, you realize that identity fraud kind of links or joins all of them up? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it is. I mean, what I now understand, and what I probably didn't understand prior to 2012, is exactly what a cross-cutting thing identity is. It's such a fundamental issue and at the heart of everything. What do we know about identity crime? Well, it's a criminal threat faced by the UK and is changing in nature, scale and complexity, because modern criminals are increasingly breaching sort of our crime prevention and security measures through deception rather than physical force. So beneath the surface of a lot of today's criminality, whether you're talking about fraud or, financial crime, people smuggling, illegal working, there's identity crime. The production and use of false documents is such a key enabler for organised criminals, because they use them to bypass monitoring mechanisms and sort of maintain the profits from their illegal activities. So when you look at identity theft and how it occurs, it's about where identity is obtained to facilitate the misuse of identity, irrespective of whether the victim's dead or alive, and it's used to support unlawful activity. It's cross-cutting, often hidden, and it enables criminal activity. And the cross-cutting nature of it means that it's been extremely difficult to establish as a priority within work of Home Office, law enforcement, government departments. But finally, I want to say that it's so extensive that the criminal production of false documents and the credentials used to assert identity, in my view, has become an established and lucrative sort of criminal enterprise in its own right. So, massive. All of that was an eye-opener for me and not something that I'd really even considered much. And yet, and sorry guys, I know I'm sort of going on here, but it's a passion for me. And yet when I think back to one of my roles as a sergeant in Essex Police was a custody sergeant. And as a custody sergeant, I was unable to decide how to process a prisoner that was in my custody block without knowing that I could be assured of who they were. Yep. If I couldn't be sure, I'd have to remand them in custody. And it's at the heart and the beginning and the centre of everything in policing that is a policing investigation. It's at the heart and front and centre of everything in financial services when you talk about onboarding people. It's immigration, all of those things. And yet we fail to join it up, and we fail to see the importance of it in portfolio work, certainly across the public sector. And it's something that I've passionately tried to work towards improving when I was there and since.
Yeah, what was that phrase that you've coined a couple of times? I loved it.
Yeah, anyone that's heard me speaking before will have heard me say it, but identity crime is of interest to everybody and a priority of nobody's.
That was the one. I didn't want to misquote it. That's a lovely little line. I love that one.
Yeah, I think it sounds like the people in the public domain were, as you were mentioning, having to deal with something that people in the private domain are now quickly coming to understand, which is that identity underpins a large proportion of the majority of the transactions and services and so on and so forward. And that's because it's only when you're sure that the individual that you're dealing with is who they say they are that you can carry on and do the rest of the processes. And I guess that applies for immigration and enforcement as well as financial services. And it's great to see that there's some form of convergence in regards to this common understanding. Hopefully, in the coming years, we'll see that identity investigation or identity proofing and validation becomes one of the core pillars of the rest of the activity in this domain or in this sector.
Absolutely. I mean, it hasn't been. It's been very fractious, very siloed thinking, and I guess in the commercial world, whether that's to do with commercial advantage issues, I don't know. In the public sector world of law enforcement, it's because policing concentrates on crime and criminality, immigration concentrates on immigration matters, and so I think one of the things that is a struggle and I hope to see improved is the coordination and join up between public and private sector and different portfolios and disciplines within the public and private sector themselves. Yeah. And we'll talk, I'm sure, a bit about sharing of intelligence, sharing of knowledge and understanding of trends and things like that. But it has to start from a position of recognising that joined up, we work from a position of strength. Yeah. And disparate, we are from a position of weakness, because criminals are fluid, they're able to move quickly, they're agile, whereas businesses and the public sector take time to respond and to react. Yeah. And we need to think more proactively about how we start to make it more difficult, make the landscape a tougher world in which criminals can operate.
Yeah, I mean, this is certainly something that's been echoed in the talks that we've had. We have a partnership with Interpol, and whenever we've been interacting with them, they're of the same philosophy as you, as we are as well, that this joined up thinking is certainly the way to go about beating it. And I think it's to a certain extent, it's just because things have become digitized and now everyone's very conscious of privacy and GDPR and your online identity. That's kind of what's highlighted or literally shone the flashlight on this particular area that otherwise has been kind of like hiding in the shadows somewhat behind everything.
Yeah, I mean, I to some degree, I think GDPR is a bit of a red herring in some of this. Clearly, where you look at the use of some false or more importantly fraudulent identities, there is the use of real data within that, and that's another issue again around identity repair and how we help people who are disadvantaged or victims in some way of identity crime to overcome that and to help repair their identity. That's certainly an issue in its own right. But for me, if it's a fake document, it isn't personal and private information. It's the creation of criminals to facilitate crime, and we should be prepared to share that and to do what we need to do with that data rather than worry and hide behind GDPR, because while we're doing that, the criminals are thriving.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think I think part of the problem is, though, it's until we get maybe something a little bit less ambiguous for the private sector, you're going to have corporations that are a little bit more worried about, you've seen cases like with BIPA in America. You've got that worry that's in the back of every corporation's mind about how they handle that personal data and where they might be liable and where they can be taken to court. So I think it's normal to expect that the legal departments of major corporations will be concerned with risk exposure. And one of the risk exposure is holding on to private or personal data. Now, I agree with Alan's point that once this data is being used for the purpose of crime, it kind of falls under a slightly different provision. But it then becomes really hard to say, right, so the photo on this document belongs to a victim who has had the portrait stolen from a database or from even some social media profile or something like that, and therefore we go into the step or the conversation of identity repair. So we need to have some kind of provision for identity repair for people to recover their identity if we were to treat all fraud as basically outside of GDPR and outside of any kind of, let's say, privacy provisions to protect those individuals.
I completely agree with you, Dimi, and I think that the thing that's missing in all of this is probably the coordination of that conversation. How do we bring the private and the public sector together? How do we provide a framework, a solution that people are comfortable with? How do we overcome this reluctance to share? And who manages? It's that back to that thing about a priority of nobody's is who leads on this, and how do we kick that conversation off? How do we? And you look at Amber Hill, and I'm sure we'll touch on the Metropolitan Police Amber Hill database and probably explain that a bit for those that don't understand it. But Amber Hill at the moment, which is the Metropolitan Police's fraudulent document database, if you like, run by the Metropolitan Police, and at the moment not adopted nationally in a way that it would be great to see it thrive, but nonetheless it's what we've got at the moment in the on the landscape and in the public sector, and it should really, I think, be a government-driven, law enforcement-driven tool that is where we bring this data together, where we interpret the data, and where we can have some confidence in the intelligence that's shared as a result of that.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I mean we'll come back to Amber Hill in a bit. I want to talk about sort of the future of document examination and national frameworks in a little bit. But before we move on from that, there were a couple of things that I was thinking about as well. I mean, so during your time where you sort of moved into the Home Office in liaison responsibility, were there any particular projects or moments that have really stuck out for you or anything like that?
Yeah, well, the first 24 years of my service was all about car chases, investigating deaths, and finding elderly and vulnerable missing persons, amongst other things. That was my world. But obviously, a brand new one. I mean, there's a number of things really, and for me, I sort of saw myself as the passion and the heart of some of this work, because having understood it and adopted it as my world really in 2012, there were a lot of things that I threw myself into. First of all, there was the reinvigorating of the National Police ID crime portfolio, which was about how do we educate and improve the understanding and the response by police forces across the country to ID crime in general. I wrote the ID crime strategy for the Home Office. There were operational things like Operation Mask, which was a multi-agency operation, which was originally to assist HMPO, but was adopted by the NCA for its launch, where they had 32 arrests, and a lot of good guidance came out of that on day one of the NCA. So there was a lot of good stuff. I could go on. I've got others on my list of things that I did, and I'm sure for me, I was in that cross-cutting, central, privileged position to be able to some degree influence that, and I left the world of public sector with a lot of unfinished business, which is probably what led me to agree to be part of the ADVP.
Yeah, and your work continues and is very much appreciated. So, I mean, coming back to this idea of national frameworks, I mean, we've touched upon Amber Hill. I mean, clearly, I was going to ask, do you think there's a need for the sharing of expertise? But I think we've covered that, and I think we're all in agreement on that. So we've got organisations like CIFAS. Do you think maybe where that's consumed by CIFAS is a non-profit organisation, for those who aren't aware, that deals with identity fraud in relation to the financial services, broadly speaking. And is consumed by the financial services to run various checks to see if people are committing identity fraud or have been encountered before by other members of that particular organisation. So do you feel like maybe CIFAS, for example, the fact that it's consumed by the financial services, do you think maybe that hides the importance of something like Amber Hill?
Well, the ADVP has been talking about this for a long time, since its inception, really. And I think, in general, the sharing of expertise and the sharing of intelligence is the right way to go. There's got to be a set of standards by which clients can rely on suppliers to deliver the appropriate level of validation, as defined by its risk assessment. So the problem that we have is that, and I talk about of interest to everybody, but again, this priority of nobody. You're right. CIFAS is in the financial world, and CIFAS is a great consumer of fake identity data. But the biggest problem is that we are not putting enough intelligence into a centralized database. We're not supporting that database enough, and we're not actually looking at how fake identity data in the world of financial services is also relevant to the world potentially of immigration, is also relevant to the world of terrorism, is also relevant to the world of people trafficking. And because we haven't got that joined up approach to the collation and the sharing and the recognition. I mean, in the policing world, police forces will stumble across identity document factories and will sometimes use their initiative and think, what is this that we've stumbled across? We might make contact with Amber Hill, might take their own intelligence from that and put that on the police national database. But of course, it's not something that is initially and immediately in the thinking of the police service that needs to go on a database. It's not necessarily in immigration enforcement's thinking that when they tackle, and they're still out there tackling document factories, that actually what they're finding could be of use to CIFAS. And it's that disparate sort of landscape that is part of the problem. And
all too siloed.
Yeah, totally. I think we're a little bit behind when it comes to this. And something I'd like to say frequently is that the fraudsters are not bound by GDPR. They're not bound by constituencies, and they're not bound by any one company's or public offices' prerogatives. So when fraudster A tries to penetrate a service, and the service blocks their attempt because they recognize that that's a false claim or a fraudulent identity being used, then fraudster goes to service B. And if service A and service B do not communicate amongst themselves, eventually the fraudster will find one service that will grant them access, which is something that we need to acknowledge. Like fraudsters are using both the light web and the dark web to communicate and to share these insights of, hey, these people are offering like this bonus when you do this kind of thing, or they have this bug that they haven't figured out yet, so they're vulnerable to get bonuses repeatedly and stuff like that. And I think the same kind of approach where we get together is what's needed to make sure. But as Alan was mentioning as well, and Simon, this joined up thinking of weakest chain in the link hasn't exactly taken hold, which is where I think organizations such as the ADVP and Cyphers and Amber Hill could champion and say, well, we know that eventually there will be a fraud loss if we don't go on and share the weaknesses and the vulnerabilities amongst ourselves, so that like the whole gets stronger.
So if you look, Dimi, at the intelligence sharing generally, it's at the heart of ADVP thinking. It's actually, for our companies, it's our most valuable asset, because by virtue of the validation methodology being electronic, the detection of fake documents can be easily evaluated and intelligence developed. And so what we as an industry, I think, need to lead on is the need to overcome concerns about sharing with each other and overcome the blockers to sharing, because we as companies conduct hundreds of thousands of checks per month, potentially offer a far greater source of intelligence than law enforcement and government. And by making what we do and what we know invaluable to the government and to law enforcement, it helps protect our industry from erosion, and cements us at the heart of future thinking. And then how do we then incorporate that and work with Amber Hill, the National Document Fraud Unit, to bring an effective, coherent, centralised database that fills gaps in our knowledge and protects all of our companies and our industry.
Yeah, and I think sort of from the meetings that you've attended, from the minutes I've heard, and the meetings that I've attended as well, you can see that there are elements of the government that are starting to lean towards it. They're starting to take this idea on board. But again, as we mentioned, it's very slow for these things to react, and you've still got a lot of maybe a little bit older thinking of sharing with private industry is bad, and there's vested interest and there's bribery concerns and everything else, or seen to be bribery concerns, and maybe that's part of what's hindering it to a certain extent. But I think you're definitely starting to see the ship starting to turn.
Yeah, I mean, there's always, and I remember when I was working in the Home Office, there was always this concern about engagement with the private sector.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I'm talking about. I had the same experiences.
Yeah. And I think it's just, the commercial advantage. There's always a concern about offering commercial advantage. I mean, that was actually at the front and centre of why the ADVP was formed, because if you go back to sort of 2017 and prior to that, you had individual organisations involved in document validation who were trying desperately to engage with the Home Office and finding it really difficult as individual companies. But as a trade association, it gives us that ability to negotiate and take out of the equation the whole commercial interest. So it's a good position to be in, but we still have to raise the understanding and the desire to come up with a solution for this, because it needs and I think actually, I mean, I don't know whether you were going to touch on this, but when you look at some of the reviews at the moment, Windrush and things like that, I think there is a real recognition at the moment. I'm finding in some of my engagements that the Home Office and others are really looking to try to find solutions and work where they can with private sector, so that they don't find themselves in that difficult position again. But there's always this historical disconnect, I think, between the public and private sector, and the Home Office will and the government will try to find in-house solutions, and sometimes they're good and sometimes they're right, and sometimes there's a lot that can be learned from engagement with the private sector.
Exactly. Wonderful. I think the next thing I was thinking we could chat about is maybe some of the financial crime issues. Dimi, if you wanted to give us a brief little synopsis on Financial Crime Enforcement Network.
Yeah, sure. So this is frequently referred to as FinCEN, or Financial Crime Enforcement Network, which is a bureau of the U.S. Department of Treasury. What they do is they tend to collect information about financial transactions in order to combat money laundering, terrorist financing, and all of the the nasty financial crimes that lead up to bigger and worse crimes. So FinCEN requires a large proportion of financial operators to submit what are called suspicious activity reports, or SARs. Anyone in the financial world will probably be rolling their eyes right now. Which is a piece of information that alerts law enforcement of suspicious activity, which may or may not be related to financial crimes such as money laundering and terrorist financing. I remember reading a statistics that said the procedure or the requirements for raising SARs is so strict, like everything that goes over a certain threshold or receives funds from a certain geography or from certain flags accounts has to be raised as an SAR. And something like over 80% of the SARs end up being unread just because of sheer volume. So we're missing a lot of the information that that is required for these organizations to submit. Recently, something like a few months ago, we've had a leak of some of the memos and documents that FinCEN, the bureau in the US, was sitting on with regards to how they view strategic risk to money laundering. And there were a few commentaries on the side of this. Essentially, a few things came out. The UK was named as a high-risk jurisdiction because of a few reasons, but the leading one was the lack of directorship authentication or verification. So in the UK, you can open a private company and registered with the Companies House without your identity ever being proven. And there were some other interesting insights from there. But I wanted to bringing this topic in of like international and intranational reporting of different kinds of trends and patterns. What do we think we can learn from it? What are some of the, let's say, red herrings in the way that this has been debated, as well as the nuggets of gold that we can dig out?
I think first of all, I do believe and agree in some of the criticisms of the SARS regime. I think it's right because I think it's a way to report intelligence. But we've been down the well-trodden path of being critical of the SARS systems around the world as being used to demonstrate compliance rather than being used to properly tackle the issues that present themselves, by not taking the steps. Unfortunately, we report it through SARS, not just banks, but, anyone that's engaged with the SARS system will report through the SARS regime, and then will they take steps to then resolve the problem, or is their job done when it's reported? And then again, when you look at FinCEN and you look at the leaks and things like that, it's clear that the SARS regime is under-resourced and is swamped. If you look back at 2016, when I was just finishing at the Home Office, there was a SARS reform team in the Home Office then that was coming up with a 3-year plan. And I see that there's an economic crime plan 3 years later in 2019 that's still talking about reforming the SARS system. So it's the best of what we've got in some ways, but it's far from perfect, and it's just not enough to file a SAR. Organisations need to look specifically, bringing it back into the identity context, who the client is, and that's the issue. When you look at SARs, when you look at guidance that's issued by the National Crime Agency, it doesn't mention, apart from being hidden away in an example further down the guidance, it doesn't talk about identity as an enabler, a significant enabler of this. And linking, again, a passionate thing of mine, but linking back to having a central database that relates to what we know about fake and fraudulent identities and their use by criminals. One of the issues and one of the problems is this bit between where it's civil and where it's criminal, where it starts and stops. Well, if you look at SARs reporting and you look at what we know about known fake identities, if we match the two of those together, immediately you're into the world of crime and not civil. You're immediately into the possibilities of seizing assets and tackling the root cause. So, I think there's a real opportunity to link identity crime into improving the SARs regime at the moment that we're not probably taking the opportunity to look at. I don't know if I've taken you off course, Dimi, but for me, to try and bring it back to that identity issue, I think there's an awful lot. And when I was involved in actually defining what identity crime was when I was at the Home Office, I mean, it was in the definition. It's a cross-cutting enabler used to launder criminal profits. And yet I'm not sure that we take the opportunities to get ahead of the game in terms of using what we know about fake identities to quickly respond and match them with a SAR and do something about it. And I hope because we've got this difference between is it a fraud, is it money laundering, can we show the crime, and the criminality in this? There's a real need to bring together and national policing agencies, National Crime Agency and the police, particularly led by the City of London and the Met, and making sure that we're seamless and joined up and quick in responding to this. And the banks at the front end of this are not just using it as going through the motions, but actually when they recognise that they've got a problem, they don't just file the SAR, but they look at the cause and the problem and do something positive about that at the front end. And I think they are more and more. But it's still a less than perfect system.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, this seems to, again, tie back into what we were saying earlier with when we were talking about CIFAS, because, again, there you've got a membership scheme for the financial services where they do flag it up. But, again, it's the interaction then goes back to the police and then gets dealt with in this swifter manner that you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the trick that's missed ultimately is the Al Capone effect. If the use of a bad identity is a great opportunity to disrupt crime, and often a good starting point for that is two starting points. One is a database of known bad identities, and two is suspicious activity reporting. And you start to bring those together and look at ways that you can disrupt criminality. There's a lot of opportunity there, and it needs, I think, to be thought about a bit more.
Yeah, I think without sounding too much like 1984, identity is a very important factor in being able to deal with all aspects of criminality, be that on one side or another. And I think if we were to leverage all of these insights that the SAR reporting regime give us, we could be a lot more quicker and a lot more adaptable in dealing with these kinds of threats. So I think I remember it being said that not all crime is identity crime, but the vast majority of successful crime ends with identity crime. Because let's be honest, if a fraudster or any kind of criminal actor would try to benefit from the proceeds of crime, they usually need to do some form of money laundering, which is underpinned by identity fraud.
Well, I'd say you think of identity fraud as the thread that runs through all crime. So if you can start picking away at that, you can eventually unweave the whole thing.
And so I suppose a big shame is that you're probably aware that there's the 6th anti-money laundering directive that's coming out at the moment, looking across Europe at how we standardise and define our approach to anti-money laundering. And there's 22 predicates, I can't say that word easily, predicate offences within that, and not one of them relates to identity. But of course, we're lucky in this country. We have got the ID Docs Act, and we do have some legislation, albeit it's underused in terms of how much we prosecute it, because we tend to go for the primary offence, and that's namely really the 22 areas that's set out in that document. but we don't highlight the cross-cutting enabler or facilitator of all of those crimes, and highlight the need to look at the cause and the opportunity that's presented by the misuse of identity. And even within that new directive, it fails for me to sort of properly highlight that or to grip that. And maybe if we did, there'd be more of an appetite for not only nationalising and evolving a database and the way we look at tackling identity as a preventative tool as well as a prosecuting tool in this country, but we're more then open to looking at that across Europe and then across the world.
Brilliant. So, what are the new risks that you see in this world that we've adopted now, where everything is far more remote? Obviously, the whole lockdown thing has made everything basically an online or a remote possibility. So, what are the new risks that are inherent with that?
Well, I mean, we know that the risk is getting bigger, and we know, again, that we need to share intelligence. Coming together as an industry with standards and sharing helps us to identify what those risks and threats are. And I suppose, just to some degree, the question is almost, how do we know what the risks are if we're not sharing the intelligence and we're not sharing information? So it's almost like we can guess. And yes, of course, we're going to see, we're going to see where the offences are taking place, and we're going to do these threat assessments. But it's very difficult to assess the threat and the risk if we're not properly sharing the intelligence. So, for example, what I can tell you about what the ADVP knows from evaluating the changes that the government put in place to the right to work checks that are done and the remote check-in, is that fraudsters aren't disappearing. We're still finding as many fake documents under the new regime as we were under the old. Yeah. So I guess it's a really, we can theorise, but for me, I have to bring it back to this thing and highlight, and hopefully for people that listen to this, I can't stress and emphasise enough that if we want to be clear about what the threats are and what the risks are, we need to be able to evaluate the intelligence, and to do that, we need to share in the first place. So maybe it's a bit of a cop-out answer, but it gives me the opportunity to really press home my passion for, as an industry, we need to come together and share, and we need to be able. We need, in the way that we run our businesses, we need to not fear through this thing about competitive advantage. Or whatever that might be, we don't need to fear the fact that if company A shares what it knows about what it's seeing with company B, that strengthens both companies. And if we then share that with government, it strengthens the industry and helps us then to answer where you started with this sort of section, is what are the threats? Because I guess I'd be guessing as much as you are, but I think the biggest threat for me is not knowing not being confident in knowing what the threats are, because we don't see enough.
Yeah, only seeing a part of the puzzle that you're working on.
Yeah, absolutely.
I find it really interesting, Alan, that you mentioned the amount of fraud has not been reduced with the introduction of the new right to work checking system, which to me suggests something like even more worrying, whereby we have seen that the amount of fraud in the right to work space is minimal by comparison with the rest of the fraud that we see in, let's say, financial systems and retail and traveling and so on and so forth. So to me, that's just the tip of the iceberg. It means that we're not observing an even higher proportion of fraud, or not sharing intelligence of a higher proportion of fraud outside of the right to work domain. And I think that is another very good plug at, yes, we need to share this information, and not only within the context of right to work, even if the government has facilitated this through the use of these new technologies and new services.
Indeed, and ultimately it comes down to evaluate each client, if you like, of ADVP companies, and each organisation out there that has to onboard people and check their identity as part of doing that needs to think about the risk. Again, it's not about just doing the minimum comply with the rules so that you avoid fines and prosecution. But it's about actually understanding the risk that your business is in, and then taking the appropriate steps and using the right level of validation to mitigate the risk. And so that may involve remote checking, and I don't think we're going to step back from that going forward. I think the current system that the government's deployed will remain, because there are those that want to see us purely in a digital world. But of course, I think documents will still have a major role to play for some time to come in the world of validation. And when you actually look at documents, I still think that checking the document is the most robust way to mitigate the risk, be it fraud, immigration, or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, given our background, I think Dimi and I would both agree on that. But certainly, it's having something that has had to go through a particularly stringent and difficult production process gives you that kind of firmer foundation to start basing everything on. If everything's completely electronic, then you can't always trust everything on face value.
No, and we actually in the ADVP now, we've written a paper on the checking of ID documents in the digital identity ecosystem, and we've also got a digital identity subgroup, which means that we're very alive to the world of digital identity going forward. But equally, the point that we're trying to make is that there is a place for digital identification, which is what we do, in a digital identity ecosystem. And of course, the expertise that our companies have in identity document validation, combined with an unrivaled source of intelligence, which is our greatest asset if we're prepared to use it, relating to fake document detection, makes us best placed really to help government and private sectors to better deploy appropriate technology to ensure that the UK's digital identity ecosystem is secure and trusted. It's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, wonderful. I think we could probably draw it to a close there, but obviously we could keep talking for days on these topics. Alan, thank you very much for your time. This has been truly fascinating, very enjoyable from my point of view, certainly.
That's great. It's a pleasure, and always happy to contribute in the future about anything specific or this in general, and maybe we need to revisit it at some point in the future and see how we've evolved. But I can't stress enough. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about something that's become a passion of mine in some ways over the last few years, and just really emphasise to the listeners, many of whom I guess are going to be interested in OnFraud, interested in ADVP, and interested in electronic document validation, that the ADVP is really there to support all of our businesses, and yet we need to recognise that together we are strong, and I think we need to evidence the value of our business and the value of what we do and how we can prevent fraud, immigration, terrorism, you name it. We have major role to play in that, and I'd welcome anybody who wants to talk to me if I can help reassure ADVP companies and others that sharing and working together is the way forward. Then I'm happy to do it, because if we crack that, I think there's so much work out there and such a strength going forward for our industry.
Thank you very much. And the ADVP, if you want to find out more about that, you can find it out on the website, which is advp.org.uk. Thank you very much for your time, Alan. It's been wonderful.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you very much for listening to today's podcast with our special guest, Alan Gooden. This podcast was produced by OnFraud. If you're interested in learning more about fraud or what we're doing to combat fraud, head over to OnFraud's website. You can also follow OnFraud on LinkedIn and Twitter. Thank you very much and have a good nice day.